Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am at The Kilns, which is C.S. Lewis's house on the edge of Oxford. Of course, when he lived here, this was a couple of miles into the countryside. So C.S. Lewis is best known as a writer of Christian apologetics, and he was also a philosopher of note. So C.S. Lewis, he's born at Belfast in Ireland in 1898, and the whole of Ireland then was part of the United Kingdom. So he was brought up in the Church of Ireland. His paternal grandparents had moved from Wales to Ireland. His mother was almost unique in having a degree in mathematics. Remember, female tertiary education had opened up just a generation earlier. So C.S. Lewis's father was a well-to-do solicitor, and they lived in a very commodious house, spacious gardens on the outskirts of Belfast. He had one brother a few years older than him. So really he had a privileged childhood. He had everything a child could reasonably want. However, when he was 9 years old, his mother died of an illness, and it was a grievous blow for him, from which he never fully recovered, and perhaps had distant and difficult relationships with women until he was in his 50s, about which more later. So his father felt unable to bring up his children. His father never re-wed and just really threw himself into his career as a way of coping with his bereavement. And so the boys were sent off to boarding school in England. Two children was an exceptionally small family for the late 19th century. So they went to a prep school, and they latterly went to Marlborough College, one of the most estimable schools in the United Kingdom. C.S. Lewis, he didn't have a vestigial Ulster accent. Anyway, so the First World War broke out, and then he came up to University College, Oxford. And the really distinguished thing about that is that I went there. Not quite the same time as C.S. Lewis. He preceded me by a couple of terms. But as the First World War was on, undergraduates were allowed to go for 1 year and then had to go off and join the army. And whilst at Oxford, you were in the OTC, Officer Training Corps, doing some military training to prepare them. But remember, this is a time when about 2% of young people went to university, and so if you had a degree or any university experience, you were definitely going to be an officer. And officers were only to be recruited from those who went to public schools, that's to say fee-paying schools, and only a small minority of people would have been to those. So it was quite rather a classist system. If you'd been to an ordinary school, could be an ordinary soldier. However, could get a field promotion, very unusual, to becoming an officer without that special officer training. So he went to UNIV, that's University College, Oxford, and every Sunday in chapel, which he attended sedulously, the names were read out of old members of the college who'd been killed in the First World War. So it seemed like he was awaiting a death sentence. Of course, he could be lucky, and perhaps the war would end before it was his time to go forward for military service, but that didn't happen. So he tried to enjoy himself. He was studying Literae Humaniores. I mean, almost everyone was doing some sort of classics in those days. UNIV was much smaller than it is now. And I don't know exactly where his room is. They don't mark it by a plaque. I suppose lest there to be too many sightseers, a bit like Bill Clinton's room, which I could show you as well. Because when I was up at UNIV, Bill Clinton was the President of the United States. Obviously, he's faded from memory a little bit since. So the only American president to have attended Oxford. So back to C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, but he wasn't known as that to his friends. His time came. He was commissioned an officer. He went to France. He's in the Royal Artillery, if I'm correct. However, he's neither killed nor wounded. Now his brother found that he was thriving in the army, and he couldn't get enough of it. So his brother actually became a career army officer. Never rose to great heights, but actually served a full 40 years or something in the army. So the two brothers are very close. So C.S. Lewis then he came back to Oxford after the war, graduated, was made a fellow. Back then, I mean, PhDs had only just started in the UK. They came from Germany originally, later the United States, later all over the world. There was no need to do higher degrees. You know, if you're one of the top first in your year, they know you're clever enough. You just start lecturing and publishing straight away. So he was Don at Magdalen College, Oxford. Much later on, he moved to Cambridge briefly in the 1950s, and then came back to Magdalen College, Oxford. Magdalen spelt Magdalene. So he was told never to trust a philologist or indeed a Catholic, but he became a great friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was both a Catholic and a philologist. So C.S. Lewis, he was obviously reading ancient Greek, and he was reading Latin and writing on philosophy. He had been an atheist for a while. It was partly because of his mother's death. So despite that, despite seeming losing his faith, he still used to attend Anglican chapel. He later came back to Christianity. He was relatively indifferent to politics because when he was a teenager, it was a time of great turmoil in Ireland. The Troubles were on. You know, he'd been a little boy when there was the Home Rule crisis, the Ulster crisis, the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant signed. I don't know whether his father signed or not, but that seems to have completely passed him by. He lived through all the tribulations of the 20th century, as in the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Second World War, and in between that, you know, fascism, the Great Depression, and this seems to have left him untouched. Extraordinary for an intelligent man with such an inquiring mind not to really have to take a position on any of this. And Oxford was sort of a hotbed of political activity, the king and country debate. So he attended colleges which were all male. Women had been at Oxford University since 1878, but very, very few, and rather secluded in their cloistered colleges. It was not till the 1950s St Anthony's, the postgraduate only college, was established, which was mixed. So Oxford dons lived in a world that was homosocial, if not quite homosexual. Until the 1870s, virtually all Oxford dons were Anglican clergy and indeed unwed. Right? Anglican priests are usually not celibate. They are permitted to marry, but they're a fellow of an Oxford college or indeed a Cambridge college. They were not allowed to marry until the 1870s. Then that rule was relaxed. However, the majority of them were bachelors into the earlier 20th century, and they could often live in college, and they were sort of like overgrown schoolboys dining together and so on. And the colleges were much, much smaller. A college would typically have 600 people, students these days. Back then it would have about 200, so they could all live on the main site. So he scarcely mingled with women at all. Then the Second World War came, and after that he became to become much better known by his radio broadcast on the BBC. The Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity and some of his publications became widely appreciated on both sides of the Atlantic, and his voice became much more familiar in the United States, where Christian evangelicism was becoming much more exuberant and zealous. So that's when he reached great fame and indeed became fairly well off, which is why he's been able to buy this rather commodious house. Now, the Chronicles of Narnia he wrote, that children's storybook, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it's about evacuees, about some children from a British city who were evacuated. They had to go away from the big city in the Second World War because the city is going to be bombed. So little children, pregnant women, elderly people, the disabled, they move out. There's no need for them to be in the cities, risk them getting killed. Men and women who are working in cities, okay, they have to stay put. There was no work from home back then. You couldn't work online. So he came here and he shared this house with his brother. But anyway, in evacuation, these little children, they go to live with a bachelor professor who lives just outside some city. Does this sound a little bit familiar? Who had large woods and gardens around his house. So it's a bit like here. Bear in mind, a lot of the houses nearby would not have existed in the 1940s. They've been built subsequently. So although he was a Magdalen Don, could have lived in Magdalen, he chose to move out after the Second World War, live here at the kilns. I presume there actually was a kiln at some point. Anyway, and he's part of this literary circle from the 1930s to about the 1960s, a very informal group with J.R.R. Tolkien and others, Inklings being a sort of double entendre, as in like a drop of ink or like a hint or a first sensation. And they used to meet at the that pub, the Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby, as it's known to Yi Conoscenti. It still stands on St Giles in Oxford. And there were others who were in it as well. His brother was a functioning alcoholic, which is something I didn't really like to acknowledge. Then he began this epistolary correspondence with Joy Davidman, an American poetess who was brought up in the Jewish faith, had abandoned it to become a communist in the 1930s, thinking that communism was the only thing that was going to save the world from Nazism. And then she came over to here. She was married, estranged from her compulsively unfaithful husband, had 2 little sons. She met him, and first it was sort of a meeting of minds, it was sort of an intellectual relationship, and then she decided she wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. Would he do her a big favor by marrying her? He agreed to wed her. I think it was a civil wedding, and that was it. And there was actually no physical intimacy between them. Now, she was not everyone's cup of char, Joy Davidman. Some of C.S. Lewis's friends gave them the cold shoulder. But then they decided a couple of years later they'd have a real marriage. They'd actually get married in church. He converted to Christianity and presumably have the physical side of marriage. And by this time, he was about 57. So it was 1955, they got married, if memory serves. But very soon it turned out that she had some terminal cancer. She'd gone to her GP several times about a lump on her breast, who'd shrugged it off. Now, you know, the situation was salvageable for her had there been early intervention. Even in the 1950s, chemotherapy was such that her life could have been saved. But they tarried, and then the cancer metastasized. She had a brief remission. They used to fly to Ireland occasionally, and then they went to Greece because she had a lifelong dream of visiting Greece, that land of ancient law, which they managed to do. However, she expired in 1960. He adopted her 2 children. And one of them sort of still speaks on his behalf to this day. One of her sons, he's an actor, he's got a completely British accent. I don't know if he's taken the name Lewis or not. Again, that was a very bitter blow to him. The only other woman he'd loved apart from his mother had died after really a very short marriage, and she died about the age of 43. So C.S. Lewis, he anonymously published a book about how to cope with such a bitter grief. Anyway, he died on the 22nd of November 1963, which happened to be exactly the same day as John F. Kennedy died, and indeed Aldous Huxley died. So C.S. Lewis's death would have been front page news, but that was wiped right off the newspapers because of the pages and pages of coverage of the murder of John F. Kennedy. So he's buried nearby, and so is his wife, although Joy David Mahan lived in a separate building for a while. Now, you can come here, you can do tours, but you have to book it, and there's sort of Christian reflection groups because of that. Now, the Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, things like that, Aslan, is an allegory. I remember reading it at the age of 10, having some faint sensation, this is somehow familiar. And my teacher, Mr. Black, said, well, I thought you would have picked up on that Aslan is the saviour who's going to liberate us all from sin. So, yeah, he wrote lots of works of theodicy, C.S. Lewis, widely appreciated to this day. But one of the quite contentious things he said, which really raised the stakes for Christians, is that Jesus Christ, he was either the Son of God or he was a charlatan or a madman. The idea he was a great moral teacher but not the Son of God, that's simply not open to us. All right, so you've got to go one way or the other according to C.S. Lewis. That's enough about C.S. Lewis. So you can see his house in situ here, the Kilns, on the edge of Oxford in the UK. He identified as Irish before the Ulster Troubles, in the 1960s and 70s version of it. So Northern Ireland's place in the UK was not seriously questioned for much of his lifetime. And he used to like to rib his English confrères that he couldn't understand them, they were completely alien to him. All right, that's enough from me. Toodaloo, everyone.